Hello again to everyone who came back to episode 2 on castrati. So, yeah, let's just dive right into it. What is a castrati? I'm sure everyone's a little lost. Castrati is the plural of castrato, so when I reference a single man, I'm going to say castrato, and when I'm referencing a group, or generally, I'll be saying castrati. The root of castrato comes from the Latin word castrare, which means to castrate, emasculate, or to prune. And you might wonder, why prune? That seems out of place with castrate and emasculate. Well, it was because after the castration procedure, the boy's testicles would be pruned. Great, graphic, super fun. So in the context of opera, castration is a procedure in which young boys' testicles were removed so that their voice would not drop. That was the goal of the procedure. And this operation was performed on castrati when they were around 7 through 12, so before puberty. And the castration was performed in hopes that the young boys' voices would not drop, and they would stay in the soprano voice of a young boy instead of dropping into the deep masculine tone of a tenor, a baritone, or a bass. Like, I'm sure anyone who knows a guy has heard that when they're young, it's this kind of high-pitched voice, and then middle school, it's like cracking left and right, super awkward, and then by high school, usually their voices dropped a lot. So castration wanted to keep that very young prepubescent high voice, and so that men could sing very high. That was the goal. And the reason the castrati's voices stayed high after castration, stayed in that boyish soprano tone, is because castration reduced their testosterone, which meant that their vocal cords stayed short. So women have short vocal cords, and that's what lets them sing higher than men. And young boys also have short vocal cords, but that changes after puberty. So by castrating them before puberty, their vocal cords stayed short and they could sing high. But then at the same time, castrati, once they grew up into adult men, they would have really large resonating chambers. And so that gave them a lot of range, flexibility, and vocal power that both young boys and even really women could not achieve. And so, and I'll go into more depth about that later, but you might be wondering, why didn't they just have women sing the high soprano parts instead of mutilating boys? Well, great question. So the reason castrati were introduced into opera, it was in the 16th century, and that was because in 1588, Pope Sixtus V issued an edict that banned women from singing in the churches. It wasn't out of the blue. He was following Paul's directive in the 1 Corinthians, which says, "Let women keep silent in the churches." And the reason the Pope issued this edict, of course, he was following the 1 Corinthians, but also it was because the Catholic Church did not want women undermining male authority in the church. And also because women singing or doing any general type of performance was seen as unseemly. And it was actually considered to be one step above prostitution. Isn't that ridiculous? Singing or theatrical performances were considered more risque than being paid to have sex with someone. Baffling to me. But you know what? Pope Sixtus V, you do you. Anyways, so when this occurred, when women were banned, obviously there was an abundance of soprano, mezzo, and alto parts that needed to be sung. So at first, these parts were given to young boys who hadn't reached puberty yet, or they were given to men who sang in their falsetto, the countertenor type. But these boys and countertenors did not have the same vocal power as women. So the church were like, this sucks. We need to fill the role that these women had quickly. And they realized that by castrating boys, they could create men who could sing in the really high soprano vocal range who had even more power than boys, male falsettists, or women. So this ushered in the era of the castrati, and that lasted approximately a century, from 1650 to 1750. That was the height of the castrati. And castrati were preferred in the church because they had mature bodies. They grew into be men, so they had male bodies that had these enlarged rib cages, and that gave them a greater lung capacity and therefore more vocal power. And the enlarged rib cage wasn't just because they were men, it was actually a specific distinguishing physical feature of a castrato. And the reason for that is because right here, the bones, castrati's bones did not fuse because of their lack of testosterone. So the bones just grew to be exceptionally long, kind of unchecked because of their lack of testosterone. So you can imagine they would have these massive rib cages. So their lungs had way more space to expand. And so therefore they could sing notes for longer. They could generally just sing with more weight and had more rooted vocal power. So actually, we know a lot about the effects of castration on castrati because the skeleton of a castrato, Gaspar Pacioretty, I might be saying his name wrong, I'm gonna put it up here in text so you can read it. He was a 19th century male mezzo, and his skeleton was exhumed so that researchers could study the effects that castration had on his body. He was just 12 when he was castrated, and he grew up to be one of the best known and most sought after opera singers of his time. So Pacioretty, like all castrati, was quite tall. He was 6'3", which was really tall back then and is still really tall to this day. And he had unusually long and spindly limbs. That's what the researchers found from his skeleton. And like I said before, these long limbs were a result of delayed fusion of the bones, specifically in his legs and arms. And castrati tended to also be affected by osteoporosis at a very young age. And because of things like low bone density and delayed fusion, the team found that Pacioretty had several fractures down his lumbar spine and also had several fractures in his legs and arms that were all related to low bone density. And that is all related to osteoporosis. So there was a lot of negative effects on castrati's body. And then externally, separate from their skeleton, castrati also had very feminine features. They never developed an Adam's apple because of their lack of testosterone, and they also were never able to have facial hair. So they looked very feminine in that way. And then also, because there was an oversupply of female hormones, there was excess fatty tissue around the castrati's thighs, hips, and even in their area of the breast. And so, as you can imagine, this created a very rounded out, curvy body. And that was interesting because that was actually a body similar to the idealized feminine body of their time. I'm actually going to insert a clip of Titian's painting Venus of Urbino because it kind of nicely demonstrates the idealized feminine body. And castrati were very similar to that. So that's strange. Okay, right now I'm sure this sounds very abstract to you, so I'm actually going to play a clip of a castrati singing, and you'll really hear the dramatic effect that castration has on the male voice. So the voice I'm going to play is of Alessandro Mareschi. He is the last known castrato, and he's actually the only castrato we have a recording of. He was a renowned singer who directed and sang for the Sistine Chapel. But the recording I'm going to play is towards the end of his life when his voice had lost a lot of its flexibility and vocal power and range and tone. And also the recording technology back then was very primitive, so his voice is going to sound a little harsher and more tinny than it would sound in person. So that was a man, if you can believe it. And that was him singing Ave Maria. I'm sure you all recognize that. But I just find that clip of Mareschi so haunting because he sounds like a boy screaming out from a grown man's body. And it's so strange to me because his voice also doesn't sound female, but it doesn't sound male. It's this weird, ambiguous in between. Yeah, so you can see how bizarre Castrati are from that clip. And then also there are clear, I'm sure you heard stylistically, it was kind of different because back then he was singing in that bel canto style, so he had a more powerful, keening, florid sound than maybe a usual like tenor you would hear. But yeah, and also the like vocal scoops, it kind of sounded like he was crying at some times, but those like rhythmic hiccups and vocal scoops, those were all intentional. That was the preferred vocal style of the time. So that wasn't because he had a lack of technique or training. He was actually following the style of the time. So yes. By the 1700s, the height of the Baroque era, Castrati were in the center of the choral and opera world. And they started out in Italy, where they sang in pretty front and center places like the Sistine Chapel Choir, and they were pretty much featured in every opera. So they were very prominent in the art world. And even though they started out in Italy, they disseminated to all over Europe. And at this point in this time period, around 4,000 boys were being castrated every year, and out of which only a few would become first-rate opera singers, and many more would actually die from the operation. And then to kind of reach this first-rate opera level, Castrati had years and years of vocal training, starting immediately after the procedure. And they went to specialized conservatorios where all they did was study singing. And so they really honed in their advanced vocal techniques and singing skills. And their style of singing really led to the bel canto style of singing, which I talked about in the last episode. And this bel canto style would dominate opera until the middle of the 1800s. And what's so crazy to me is that Castrati became so successful in opera that the majority of male opera singers in this time were castrated. Like, just wrap your head around that. The majority of male opera singers were castrated. How ridiculous is that? So how did it come to be that way? Well, Castrati reached such popularity because they not only played a lot of female parts during the Baroque era, but they also played the male parts, so they were kind of all-encompassing. And more often than not, actually, the Castrati played the romantic male hero. So you're probably wondering, like, a man singing in this female soprano vocal range doesn't really fit up with like our contemporary ideas of masculinity. But the reason that the soprano voice was preferred back then is because it was seen as like a perfect melting of youth, romance, and the purity of heart. So that's why they wanted soprano voices to sing like the romantic male lead. But Castrati often debuted in their opera world, playing the young, beautiful female lead, which is funny because like I said, they were more often than not like 6 feet tall. They had these huge chests and rib cages. So I don't know if the audience was supposed to see them and be like, wow, what a beautiful young lady. I don't know. But obviously they knew they weren't women. But it was interesting that's how they debuted. And then as they matured, they transitioned to other female parts other than the young romantic lead. But more often than not, after debuting, they would go on to play the male hero. And like I said, this shocked me when I first read this because Castrati are the opposite of contemporary images of masculinity that the media projects. Growing up, obviously now, masculinity is subjective and constantly changing, but growing up, I felt that the ideal masculine man would be someone with this chiseled six-pack, a super deep voice, doing like 100 pull-ups and having 20 girls in bikinis flocking around him 24/7. I'll just play a clip of how media portrays masculinity right now so you can see the contrast between Castrati. So here's that clip.
We don't need ropes to climb the wall.
And yeah, so castrati could not be more different than this stereotype. But like I said, masculinity is subjective, so I can't compare our image of masculinity to Baroque era ideas about masculinity, but it's still really interesting. And Baroque audiences loved castrati. They were really the stars of their time. To give you an example, there was no bigger star than the castrato named Farinelli. That was his stage name. There was actually a Golden Globe winning movie made about his life. Farinelli's voice in the film, they have him singing songs from operas he performed in, and they made his voice in the film by mixing the male countertenor voice and a female soprano voice, which is so cool. I would totally recommend this movie. I don't think any of you are going to go watch it, but I recommend it because it gives you a sense of the stardom of these castrati. But Farinelli was an outlier. Most castrati did not reach this heightened stardom. Most castrati actually couldn't find work in big scale operas, or they fizzled out, they gave up on their singing. So they would play parts in low scale operas or in small church choirs, and a lot of them actually were poor and were pretty much died out on the street, hungry and castrated. So not a good life. It was really rough. It did not bother audiences that castrati didn't sound like men or women, and that they were in this weird middle. They were really seen as an abstraction, kind of more godlike than human. Dorothy Kaiser, a retired professor who studied castrati, kind of summarized castrati's emergence in the opera world as by saying, quote, choices of vocal timbre originally made to accommodate the religious scruples of the Catholic Church effectively erased the association between sung voice register and gender to the Baroque ear. So kind of to put that in more simple terms, what started out as a desire from the church to separate women from the stage and keep men and women separate inadvertently led to an art form and to a type of performer, the castrati, that blurred gender in outrageous ways. So how ironic. The church really messed up on that one. But yeah, I just thought that was funny. But yeah, Baroque audiences did not expect or even want realism. But castrati were not the first example of gender bending in art. It had actually been accepted in theater for a while. To give you an example, in the 15th century, commedia dell'arte was a form of theater that could be identified by its improvised dialogue and its cast of stock characters. You actually see a lot of these stock characters in a lot of productions today. They're pretty common, and commedia dell'arte really solidified these stock characters. Some examples are like the spurned lover or the strict head of the household. And in commedia dell'arte, gender was not tightly aligned to casting. So a woman could play a male role, a male could play a female role. And it was most common, though, to see a woman playing a masculine role that was more often than not the adolescent boy. So I'm going to play a clip of what commedia dell'arte is, because I think it's a super cool form of art. And yeah, it's really interesting. I'll play a clip now.
Gemma, look at us.
Okay, so as you can see, commedia dell'arte is a super cool form of art. I wish it was more popular because it's really fun to watch. But anyways, yes, so the gender bending in commedia dell'arte carried over into the castrati, and gender bending carries on in art today. But even though the audiences knew that castrati were not female when they played female roles, or when they played male roles, they weren't singing in the male vocal range. So all this blurring of gender, audiences actually loved that because it made them so transgressive and thrilling to watch. I've got to talk about women. I've been ignoring them all episode. But anyways, so when castrati weren't available, women would be the fill-in. And this is important as we enter the next period of opera after the decline of castrati and the reappearance of women in opera. So castrati and how they blurred gender in opera carried out into their personal lives as well. In an account in 1745, one man wrote that he had run into a famous castrati in a coffee shop, and he wrote that, quote, "His hips and thighs make me think him a girl in disguise," end quote. And then he said that the castrati turned to him and, quote, "gave me a bold look and said that if I would spend the night with him, he would serve me as either a boy or a girl, whichever I choose," end quote. So these types of reports only add to the sense that castrati were exciting and titillating because they flouted social norms. And again, I find this episode in papal history so ironic, a parable for unintended consequences. The church's puritanical edict against women singing led to castrati who glamorized this kind of risque lifestyle, which was in exact opposition to the original intentions of the church. Some scholars of castrati have suggested that this fluid sense of gender during the Baroque period was due to the scholarly view, popular at the time, that there was a single sex, male, obviously, and that women were actually just the inverted male sex. And of course, they were inferior to men, even though they were the same sex. So if you were a person alive during the Baroque period, gender might not have felt so separate, man and woman. There was a little bit more, I keep using this word, but it's the right word to use, ambiguity in between. And so seeing a man play a woman and a man in an opera didn't seem so strange to people back then, if that makes sense. In fact, men and women might have been seen as more similar than different. Thomas LaCour, a history professor at UC Berkeley, wrote extensively about this one-sex model that then evolved into the two-sex model. And that two-sex model emerged in the latter part of the 1700s as the Baroque period gave way to the classical period of the Enlightenment. The shift from the one-sex to two-sex model was a theory for one of the reasons why castrati declined in popularity. So during the one-sex model, when gender was more ambiguous, castrati embodied this ambiguity, and they were kind of the ideal at the time. But when the two-sex model emerged, and it was man and woman as distinctly different, castrati didn't fit either side, and so they were shunned as they were seen as neither man nor woman, but rather this third, unnatural, unacceptable gender. And then another reason other than the one-sex and two-sex model is because in this time period, the changes in taste for opera shifted from, in the Baroque era, it was fantastical, it was all over the place, very ornamental, but when we shifted to the Enlightenment, audiences wanted a greater sense of realism in the operas. And there was also a growing sense of moral unease about castrating boys, especially outside of Italy. So yeah, during the Enlightenment, people were thinking about morality, about science, so the whole castration thing was not as appealing as it used to be. And so, as a result, prepubescent castration for the purpose of opera diminished in the late 18th century, and by in the 1800s, castrati voices were pretty much a thing of the past. And the final nail in the coffin was when the Papal States, the last to prohibit them, made it illegal in 1870. 1870 low-key seems like a very late year to prohibit them. I was hoping it would be a little earlier than 1870, but you know. And then Alessandro Moreschi, who you heard earlier, he was the last official castrato, and he retired from the Sistine Chapel in 1913. So that was the end of it. And just kind of quickly to give my own opinion, I just feel so bad for castrati on so many levels. Castrati's lives were irreversibly changed before they were teenagers, before they had a say in their lives. And what they would do for the rest of their lives, whether or not they would have kids or marry, all of that was decided for them when they were boys. And whether they wanted it, singing became their entire lives. And I just think that's really, really sad. Obviously, I'm sure you guys agree. But as you can expect, castrati typically came from lower class families, and it was kind of out of an act of desperation. Singing was the only road to a better life for them and their families. So parents who felt pushed against the wall would permit their boys to be mutilated like that. And like I said earlier, few castrati were lauded and feted. Most toiled in poverty and obscurity in the choirs of rural churches, and they didn't have a family to comfort them. So it was really not a glamorous life for most of them. So what did this rise of castrati reflect, and what are the implications for women? The rise of the castrati reflected the way women were seen and treated in opera and society generally. Women were forced from the stage, where they'd previously been performing, and then they were replaced by men who were mutilated to sound like them and even resemble them to a degree. So what does that say? It says a couple of things. First, the church, who was really had a very big say in society and what society thought, they believed that women should not be seen in public and that they should not have a public life that was in any way different from their role as a wife and a mother. That should have been their only role, was being a domestic, loving wife who supported men in their lives. And I mean, that theme of women not being able to participate in the public and or being confined to their homes and domesticity, that carried on for a very long time. That was not specific to the Baroque era. Second, women needed to be regulated because of their potential to incite depravity and other forms of evil in men. Women singing and performing was unseemly and dangerous to men. And again, this is a theme that has been in society for a very long time. This could go back even to the story of Adam and Eve, where Eve tempted Adam with the apple from the tree of knowledge, and Eve messed up, getting them both kicked out from the Garden of Eden. So yeah, women are the temptress, and they're evil, in short. And then third is that women were seen as a variation of men under this one-sex philosophy, which was popular at the time. They were seen as a worse version of men. And again, I would say that this is carried on as a theme in society, women as inferior, weaker, less powerful than men. So to summarize, the rise of the castrati and the exclusion of women from opera suggests that women were seen as inferior people who needed to be controlled for the benefit of men. And the men were the first-class people, obviously. They were the ideal. And I guess you could even say that women were at the very bottom, and then there was castrati in the middle, and then there was the men. So that little hierarchy in the Baroque era. And then when women replaced castrati and played the heroic male lead, they were known as women en travesti. Fun fact, the term travesti in Latin American countries describes people who have been assigned male sex at birth but develop a gender identity according to different expressions of femininity. So that's not the term. That's not how I'm going to be using the term in this context, but it still relates to gender ambiguity in Latin America. I don't know, I'm getting sidetracked. I thought that was interesting. But anyways, for this series, the term is limited to actual women singing in opera serio cross-dressing. So that's a woman in travesti. And we're going to learn about singers en travesti in the next episode. So tune in. Thank you for listening.